Okay, and we are live. Welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone who is in this Zoom room and also everyone on the live stream. My name is Chantal Bilodeau. I am one of the co-curators of the Green Rooms, and I'm really happy to have you with us. If you were with us earlier at some of the sessions this afternoon, we appreciate you sticking with us because it's now the fourth one. So it's many hours of staring at a computer screen. And if you were with us right before this, I want to acknowledge that this was a conversation between Sarah and Ravi, very powerful, moving and honest conversation, and something that I keep with me in my heart and that I will be thinking about for a very long time. So now we are moving to, as I said, the fourth session of the second day of the Green Rooms. We started yesterday and we have one more session tomorrow and two more later tonight for those of us who are on the East Coast. The Green Rooms are produced by English Theatre at the National Arts Centre and presented by FOLDA in collaboration with the Canada Arts Council, the City of Kingston, the National Theatre School, and HowlRound Theatre Commons. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the mission control for this event is located in Kingston, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. Kingston is covered by Treaty 57, and the territory was acquired in 1783 in Crawford's Purchase. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Tom Green, an ecological economist who focuses on climate issues at the David Suzuki Foundation. Tom is going to talk about what role the economy can play in reverting the climate crisis. Please feel free to use the chat to comment along the way, and there will be a formal Q&A section at the end of the talk. Here's to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Chantal. I'm very delighted to be here today and join you. And so thanks to Chantal, Sarah, Megan, Sophie, and all the others organizing this. And it's just really terrific to be part of this event. I would never have become an ecological economist if I hadn't thought the planet was in such dire straits. I would have probably gone into the arts in some way, maybe theater or creative writing. But I just felt that this was a place where I could have the most leverage because the economy is so influential in what humans do. And economic theory, as I'm going to go through in this talk, is having a very large impact on our ability to address climate change and on the kind of things that drive society. So with that, I'd like to give you a little presentation that I'm very open for questions. And I also, as an experiment, I have also made a place on a Google presentation where you could meet and add thoughts, questions, observations. And so I can see if I can share that here. So maybe at the end, oh, I just sent that privately, apparently. Maybe Megan, you can send that out. All right, so I'm going to share my presentation now and really look forward to your questions. All right, so what I want to give you is some insights from ecological economics. What a lot of people don't realize is that there are different schools of economic thought. And mainstream economics is what tends to be used by business, by government, but it's and it has a long and storied history, but there are minority views within economics that are very critical of that perspective and feel that it is bringing us great problems. So I'm really pleased to speak to you today from the unceded Coast Salish territories, the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And given the moment we're in and everything that's been happening south of the border and now around the world on Black Lives Matters and all the police violence and so on, here I am, a white middle-aged guy, speaking about economic theory, which has largely been the domain of white privileged middle-aged men. So I just want to acknowledge that from the start, that, you know, I'm coming from a bit of a problematic position here. And one thing that I think is quite appalling is that the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, which isn't really a real economics Nobel Prize, she won in 2009. And since then, there's only been one other woman who's won, and that was 2019. So you can see how that's influencing the kind of economic theorizing that's happening. The great thing about Elinor Ostrom, from my perspective, is she also contributed to the ecological economics literature. So she was critical of some of the things we're going to see ahead. Now, governments focused on economic growth after World War II. And why did they do that? You know, we had the war, it created a lot of employment, wages kept going up, businesses were very busy, and then they were very worried that the economy would shrink, there would be unemployment, there would be social strife. So the US Council of Economic Advisors came up with this solution, which was that the state should keep ensuring that the overall national US economy would grow. And that with that, it would mean that there'd be jobs, tax revenues, profits, and social harmony, because if the pie keeps growing, you don't have to argue about how big the individual slices are so much. So let's look at the good news from an economics perspective of the last, especially since the 1950s. If we look here, especially if you look at the box, the top middle one, real GDP, that's the size of the economy. And we can see this remarkable phenomenon. This is the global economy, just grows incredibly, as does things like fertilizer consumption, paper production, transportation, telecommunications, international tourism. So for an economist, all these things suggest incredible amount of economic success over the last century. Now, the problem is that ecological indicators in this second graph show a lot of the biosphere is under increasing stress, particularly since the 1950s. We see this great acceleration, for instance, in the level of carbon dioxide, of methane, of the ocean acidification, forest lost. So this is no longer such a great success story when we look at it from an ecological perspective. From a social perspective, it's true that lifespans have improved over this period, and there's many indicators that have improved. But what we see, especially in the last 30 years, is a real increase in inequality around the globe. The rich are getting much richer, and everyone else is staying where they were at, or perhaps getting worse off. So if I were to think of this as a theatrical piece that might be performed on another planet to explain what went wrong with humanity, this is this 1972 study that I'm going to talk about is something, for me, it's a great tragedy of human history, because this study comes out in 1972, and it basically shows that there's a big conflict between economic growth and a healthy biosphere. And mainstream economists, as a chorus, dismissed this, and so did the business press. And so, although it was initially very successful, over 30 million copies of this study were read, it was translated into various different languages, it was quickly dismissed and disappeared. And the study I'm referring to is Limits to Growth. It was a report to the Club of Rome, and it was looking at the predicament of mankind, of course, with the language of the day. And it's interesting to think that some of the things that were worrying the members of the Club of Rome at the time have parallels to today. They were trying to understand these complex global interacting problems. And so they were seeking a team that would help them be able to understand that. And there was a team at Massachusetts Institute of Technology that were using computer models to examine complex interactions, complex systems. And so they retained them, and after they developed a model, which was much more complex than the typical economic model, they reported their findings on March 2nd, 1972 at the Smithsonian Institute. And what they did with their model is first they gathered all the data they could find from 1900 to about the late 1960s and used that to calibrate their model to make sure that it represented these interrelationships in a credible way. And then they ran their model forward to the year 2100. And what it showed is that if humanity pursued economic growth, collapse would be very likely. And I've just shown you one scenario here. They ran the model various times with different scenarios. And this one's called the World Model Standard Run. And basically under this scenario, they just assumed that the world would continue as it was. It would continue with this focus on economic growth. And that would be the main public policy imperative. So here we are at about 2020, and we're at this point where it suggests that industrial output starts to fall, and indeed shortly after that, population starts to fall. So they're finding, here we have one of the key paragraphs from their book. Limits to growth will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. So that would be by 2070. And unfortunately, it means a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. And industrial capacity, you can also understand by the size of the economy, the ability to produce output that we use in our daily lives. So as I said, mainstream economists dismissed this study and continued to defend economic growth. It was described by some of the top economists, and William Nordhaus here, Measurement Without Data, he became co-author of one of the most influential economics textbooks of the 20th century, and so affected the thinking of thousands and thousands of people who went on to become business leaders, politicians, and so on. And in that textbook, they very clearly dismissed this study. And I don't know how many of you ever have used Google Scholar to look up a scholarly paper, but when I did this in 2015, I did this, I looked up biophysical limits, ecological limits, or planetary boundaries in the American Economic Review, which is one of the most prominent economic publications or academic journals. And here we see that there was one result. It was in 1974, and it was actually written by the person who went on to found ecological economics, or was one of the co-founders, Herman Daly. So despite that, all the evidence that the Earth is showing worsening environmental trends, mainstream economists continue to be focused on wealth generation, international trade, and things like that, and they haven't looked at the ecological constraints that we face. So we've now had 48 years since that study was produced, and so it's a good time to ask, how well does it match up with their projections? And here I just look at one indicator, and you can see their original pollution projection was the red line, and where we are is basically the orange line. That's using CO2 as a proxy for pollution. And so we are basically slightly off the curve, but really going in the wrong direction. In a few years ago, 2016, the All-Party Parliamentary Committee on Limits to Growth in the United Kingdom reviewed all the evidence and came to the conclusion that the Limits to Growth report of 1972 was very much and the standard run, what I've referred to, which is basically just pursuing economic growth and not learning to adapt any of our policies to address things like climate change in any real way, that's the path that we were still on. So very concerning in that way. One thing I think it's important to understand is, despite all our efforts through different international climate accords and protocols and agreements, if you look at GDP here, which is the size of the economy, gross domestic product, that's the orange line. And if you look at emissions, it maps very, very closely to the size of the economy. Now, you'll hear increasingly this idea that we can have clean growth, that we can have green growth, that we can decouple the economy from emissions. But despite all our efforts to date, on a global scale, we aren't succeeding. There are some countries that are doing better than others, like the UK's emissions have come down quite a lot. But on a global scale, we're not making much progress. And as you know, we face this real challenge of fossil fuels. And here we see two possible futures. Darker red and purple is a much higher temperature range. And depending on which pathway humanity chooses, we either end up hotter than we are now and still a problematic level, or very hot with perhaps much of the tropics basically uninhabitable. We also know that even if you didn't have the global warming problem, the fact that you burn CO2s and the CO2 goes into the ocean, it helps acidify the ocean, and eventually it makes it unsuitable for a whole bunch of marine ecosystems and species. And so we could have collapse in that way. So mainstream economics is a roadblock to addressing climate change, in that it has a few kind of fundamental founding beliefs, you could say. First is that a healthy economy needs to grow, as I've discussed. And we see that, I mean, there is a real aspect to that, in that every time the economy starts to shrink, people do get laid off, and there are all sorts of social implications. So there's an aspect in which that's true, but that's because we've designed an economy that needs to grow in order to not throw people out of work. Another idea is that well-being increases with consumption, that wealthier societies take better care of the environment. So actually we should focus on getting wealthier so we can address our environmental problems. And that biophysical limits to growth are an illusion, because markets are very good at addressing scarcity. You know, if bread starts to get scarce, the price goes up, more bakers produce bread, people reduce their bread consumption, switch to rice, and there's no scarcity of bread. So that idea that you can apply that to the ecological level. One of the biggest problems, though, as I mentioned earlier, this whole thing about well-being improving very unevenly with economic growth. We have this worsening inequality, and we have a problem of structural environmental racism. Now we have that 26 billionaires have the wealth of the 50% of the world, bottom 50% of the world's population. And the place where things like waste dumps, industrial facilities that pollute tend to be placed is, of course, in racialized communities. This idea that richer societies take better care of the environment doesn't actually match up to the evidence very well, because here we see this graph on one side is increasing CO2 emissions, and on the right is increasing wealth. And these are log scales, so each time you go up one of those notches, you're actually talking about 10 times more emissions, or 100 times more emissions. And likewise, you're 10 times or 100 times more wealthy. And what we can see is that Canada, the US, Australia are in the upper right. We are the wealthier countries, and we are putting the biggest ecological footprint on the planet. And I think you all knew that, but you know, here's the data to show it. So if we go to one of the first year textbooks that everyone reads to, as they try and learn about the economy, we see that Mankiw, one of the most influential textbook authors of the 21st century, he argues that economists aren't concerned about limits to growth because technological process fixes them. And he gives the example of, it's possible to extract much more oil from the oil sands in Alberta than was once thought possible. But of course, extracting much more oil is about resources. It's not about whether you're within the planetary boundaries. And on this graph on the right, which is from the Pembina Institute, you can see the crazy increase in emissions from Canada's oil sands, basically 4 times higher in 2020 than they were in the year 2000, which is really going so much in the wrong direction when we're in the middle of a climate crisis. One thing we're really frustrated with is that the models that mainstream economists use don't show the biosphere. Here we have firms and households trading, money flows around, the labor resources flow around, but there's no representation of the biosphere. And here's the model that is used to understand economic growth, the size of the economy. We have capital and labor. You must be asking yourself, what am I doing after all these lovely artistic things talking about economics after a long day of Zoom meetings? And I'm sorry, but I hope this is helpful. Anyways, there's missing the environment. So ecological economists try to bring in a fuller picture, look at the economy as something powered by solar energy that extracts energy and resources from the biosphere, that causes wastes and pollution. And then there's feedback loops where the wastes and pollution have impacts on biosphere, which affects the resources that we can use. It may affect human health and so on, as the limits to growth model showed. So we advocate for keeping a limit on the scale of the economy. In other words, the size of the economy relative to the biosphere. And that can be done by various ways, and that's putting limits on where the economy can happen and what kind of activities can happen. So that can be things like having protected areas, respecting Indigenous rights, shifting to renewable energy, taking a circular economy approach, and so on. Also very useful is to do things like 4-day work weeks, a better income redistribution, guaranteed annual income. So there's not this pressure to have the economy grow, otherwise people are going to be out of work. A few years ago, 2009, a bunch of scientists came up with the idea of the planetary boundaries framework. And they looked at all the different things about the biosphere that we should really do our best not to disturb beyond a certain safe operating space. Because if we do, we put our future in danger, and we also reduce the quality of life, make it more difficult, create more challenges. So here we see that the different boundaries they have, and some of them are already yellow. So in the zone of increasing risk, so climate change is in that category. And then we have flows of nitrogen are clearly beyond where they should be, in a zone of high risk. And then some of these other boundaries have not been quantified. Well, Kate Raworth, who used to be with Oxfam, is a great economist from the UK. And she looked at that, she said, well, there's something missing here. And what's missing is that we don't have the social foundations. We haven't got in there the things that people need in order for well-being. And so she introduced donut economics. And basically we want to be within that nice green donut there where we're meeting the social foundations. We don't have a deficit there. So people are getting their needs for food, health, education, political voice, peace and justice, etc., met. And at the same time, we are not exceeding the ecological ceiling. Clearly, we're exceeding the ecological ceiling on climate change now. The great news is that this is now being applied in the real world. We see it in New Zealand, Bhutan, and recently Amsterdam, as one reaction to the COVID pandemic, is bringing in donut economics. And the whole focus in New Zealand's well-being budget is let's shift away from trying to have an ever bigger economy, and let's look at what gives people well-being. And in Bhutan, a long time ago, the king said, let's go for gross national happiness, not gross national product. Since you're in the arts and many of you are in theater, I just wanted to bring to your attention how much economics is about theater. Economists are put on stage to explain what goals matter, what the limits are to what society can afford, why we can't do certain things. And they're very powerful in that way. So just to keep in mind the speed at which we have to transition in this to meet what the IPCC tells us is 1.5 degrees is kind of our safe limit of change. I mean, anything is regrettable. You know, if we could end up at 1.3 rather than 1.5, that would be better. But we're unlikely to come in any lower than 1.5. We'd be very lucky to be 1.5, because here you can see our annual emissions here from as a result of burning all those fossil fuels and how quickly we have to bring down those emissions. Basically, we need to bring down carbon emissions by about 7% a year or more to meet that target. In this pandemic, global emissions are likely to come down by about 6% over the course of the year globally. So we've got to reach 7% on an annual basis, and we reached 6% by basically shutting down economies, by stopping flying, by really dramatically reducing how much we drive, by reducing all sorts of activities. And yet, even with all that, and I'm not arguing at all that that's the way we want to reduce emissions, far from it. This pandemic is a tragedy, and it's, you know, so unfortunate that we can't meet in person. But it just shows how hard it is going to be to bring down those emissions. So here I have Canada's emissions from 1990 to 2017, and you can see that they were rising up until about 2005, and then they kind of fizzled about. Various policies were introduced, but there's very little sign that we are bringing it down to the level that we need. Despite a lot of effort at the federal level to put in things like a price on carbon pollution, to offer incentives to buy electric vehicles, and now future plans to help transit authorities buy electric buses. So there are things that are helping, that are happening, that will be helpful. But a big part of the reason why we have this problem is because Canada's oil and gas sector is just so big, and it's been growing its emissions. So we can see that sometimes people think that, you know, they've got to change how they do things. That's helpful, but let's remember that it's not so much, the onus is not so much on individual action. What we need is strong policies that steer the whole economy and that equitably make that shift to a decarbonized future. And one policy that is never considered by government, unfortunately, is to focus on well-being instead of economic growth, because economic growth creates a greater challenge of bringing down emissions. If you're richer and richer every year and you're consuming more, then you really have to use the cleanest technology to reduce overall emissions. If we didn't grow the economy, but just tried to stay at kind of a steady state, it would make our task much easier. I should have mentioned at the beginning of this that I'm giving this talk on my own and not as a representative of the David Suzuki Foundation, but I couldn't resist grabbing this one slide from work I've done for the foundation, where I summarized all the studies that were available up till 2017 on how to reduce Canada's emissions down by at least 80% by 2050. And what we found by looking across all these different studies is that there's very common themes. We have to learn to do more with less energy. We have to produce more renewable energy, clean energy. And then really important is we have to swap out fossil fuels and electrify just about everything. So if you think your house is heated with a furnace now, it needs to be heated with a heat pump. Also, the insulation levels have to be improved. But number 9 here is the one that wasn't actually in all those studies and that I added. And it's that really as a society, we should be forgetting about growth, or that should no longer be our focus. It doesn't make sense. We know it's not improving well-being. And instead, what we should do is seek to improve well-being by living within the donut. So I guess now is a good time to shift to Q&As. I'm really happy to take your questions. I see now.
I'm back with you, Tom. Thank you for this great presentation. If anybody wants to put questions in the chat, we will read them out loud, and Tom can try to answer some of them.
Sure. Oh, okay.
I don't understand number 6, which was in your last diagram that you showed. What does mobilize money mean?
So the idea is that if we are going to get ourselves off fossil fuels, we are going to have to, as a society, make big investments. We are going to have to retrofit all the apartment buildings and homes and office buildings, commercial buildings across Canada. That's going to take a lot of money. We're going to have to shut down coal-fired generating stations and replace them with wind turbines, solar panels. We are going to have to invest in charging infrastructure. We are going to have to invest in, electrified public transit. So it's about moving a lot of money to where it needs to be and stop investing in the fossil fuel extraction. The Canada Pension Plan invests on our behalf in the oil sands quite heavily. And also as a result of that, it's lost quite a bit of money for us. We've got to really stop those kind of investments. We've got to pressure our banks to stop investing in fossil fuels and switch to the clean economy. So that's number 6.
We have also 2 questions that have to do with how, like, if we move away from growth, but the whole system is geared towards that, how do we do that? And then how do we get mainstream economists and political leaders to get on board with a different kind of economy?
Well, there's a joke that economics changes one funeral at a time. And unfortunately, there's a lot of truth to that. The economic elders of this society tend to hold the top positions. They control who publishes in their journals, who gets promoted, and so on. I don't worry so much about convincing mainstream economists. I think it's much more important to convince the public at large, and to that's why the work of Kate Raworth on donut economics is really, really, really helpful. It's about the public learning more about different ways of seeing the economy. And it's about people demanding when a politician is there and they're saying, my party is going to give you more economic growth. Saying, well, who cares about economic growth? We want well-being, and we also don't want to screw over the biosphere. So now the second question was, we do have this economy that is geared to growth. How do we shift to something that isn't and not go through a period of incredible economic disruption? And that is a big challenge, but there are certain things that can be done. For instance, I work at the David Suzuki Foundation. We have a 4-day work week, and that's great. It gives us more time to volunteer. It gives us better mental health. You can make more stuff at home, so you don't feel a need to consume as much. Our income is more modest because we're in the nonprofit sector. I'm sure lots of you know about that. and that means we consume less. But there's a trade-off where we have increased happiness because of that time. Right now, the economy is very much geared, much too much, to the interests of people who own shares. It's geared to the interests of the 1%, and we have to take that back. And that requires the kind of mobilization, the crowds pushing for, better policies. And I think one silver lining of the COVID pandemic is it has opened up the opportunity to consider new ways of doing things. So, for instance, Spain is going forward with a kind of guaranteed annual income approach where, everyone gets an income. If they're employed, unemployed, you still get this income, so that you don't have this situation where precarious workers or gig workers, COVID comes along and suddenly they have no source of income whatsoever. They will set up this much more sensible way of doing things.
And is it reasonable to think that, for instance, with the basic income, if you take care of people that way, you can actually reduce a lot of your other governmental programs that are supposed to be there to help people in difficulty?
Yeah, that's very much true. You reduce, say, some of your social assistance programs because everyone's got a guaranteed income. But the great thing that's been found, where there have been experiments around the world where this has been tried, and the really amazing thing is, let's say you have a single mom who, under current system, is not able to go back to school and really get new skills or something because they don't have the money set aside and they can't afford childcare and so on. That by giving a guaranteed income, they can actually use that to pay rent and food, and then that allows them to go back to school. So over the long run, they can be, get back involved in society in a way that makes them feel more fulfilled and contributes.
We have a question also about the arts. You touched a little bit in it in your presentation, but the question is, how do you see the role of the arts in ecological economics?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think one of the challenges is that, logical arguments only take people so far. And really, we're in such a precarious situation in that we have an economy that is basically undermining the biosphere on which we all depend upon. So, but, the standard articles, arguments, and so on are only reaching a certain segment of the population. Arts reaches people also in a different way, and it touches on values, and I just think it has this opportunity to offer a deeper reflection, a more intuitive sense of what's wrong, of opening up exploration and not pointing to, detailed specific solutions, but more encouraging people to be part of that conversation. But of course, everyone on this call, there's so many great artists here. I'm sure that I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that. I'm sure there's better suggestions.
I can see that I'm in a Jesus light at the moment because the sun just came out of my window. Yes, one thing I wanted to add to what you just said is I think probably a whole lot of people are not aware that there is actually alternatives to thinking about the economy, because the powers that be are very happy for us to believe that, capitalism is the end all and be all of everything, and that's all we can do, and it's never going to change. So, just mentioning the fact that there are alternatives, that there are people who are thinking about them and even trying to implement them is something very useful.
Yeah, for sure. I see that Becky Miller just put a comment in here that the absence of females in economics, and it's a huge problem. Absence of females, of people of color, the fact that economists in Africa or South America or elsewhere in the world really don't tend to have the influence that economists out of 5 universities in the US and the UK have is appalling. And so the discipline has looked at a narrow set of problems and has looked at it in a very specific way.
This ties into, I think, the conversation we had before that was about systemic racism and how do you change the whole system to make room for people to access to leadership, right? So the fact that there aren't no pathways maybe for women and people of color to be able to access to leadership roles in the related to the economy is itself a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure it is. The situation in ecological economics is definitely much better, I think, because it has attracted people who are, a lot of ecological economists come at it because they're working on a specific ecological issue with a community or in a region. And that often is their entry point into the discipline. So here's my story. When I wanted to study ecological economics, I first tried to do a master's. The economics department at the University of Victoria did everything they could to keep me out of the university because they didn't want me studying ecological economics. Then I tried to do it at the University of British Columbia. I had to do it outside of the economics department because the economics department still doesn't recognize the existence of ecological economics.
That's terrible. Okay, here's another question. For a non-economist who is armed with Google search, what are we looking for when looking for alternatives to capitalism?
I mean, in Canada, there's lots of good work done by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I don't know if you know them. They write a lot on economic issues. And they have really great analysis on how we can structure things for a more equitable economy. So sometimes the code word progressive economics is used to find these kind of things. But even it's hard for people to publish when they're producing outside of that mainstream, like the World Bank doesn't tend to do articles by them.
And one thing people can also look up is donut economics, right?
Yes,
Kate herself, the economist who came up with the theory, has a website, and there's a lot of good resources on that.
Yeah, and she's got a book, Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think as a 21st Century Economist. And I see someone just mentioned her TED Talk. She's got a fabulous TED Talk, so I really recommend that. And she's a really dynamic speaker and has brought a lot of insight and has really been influential in even at fairly high, level institutions.
Okay, we have questions from the live stream. 2 questions. What organizations can I support that will be the most impactful towards making active change? And where does hydroelectricity fit in the conversation?
Yeah. For the first, if you go to the Canadian Action Network, Climate Action Network, or Région Action Climat, that has a listing of all the environmental groups that are working together across Canada on climate change issues. It has some of the big ones like David Suzuki Foundation and Environmental Defense Canada, Pembina Institute, Équiterre is in Quebec, a really good one.